Thank you so much for having me here. What a pleasure. And of course, after Michael, this is a very hard show to follow. What a wonderful, wonderful morning, way to start the morning. So I'm going to talk about innovations in impact and measurement and what are we learning. I'm Joe, and I work also at the Green Climate Fund, as also at Columbia University. And yes, thank you very much again for having me here. So I'm going to talk to you about a few things. So let me see if I can get this right. Deep fakes and exploding myths, and how innovations today in evidence production are helping us to explode myths. Yes, we can. All of you know Obama. So technology helps, and helps us to think about how we can produce good evidence to explode these myths. And after Michael, it seems like a nice segue. So the last mile. What can we do to think about delivering? And where does science stop and where does practice start? So I'm going to think about and invite you to think about behavior. And last but not least, I'm going to talk very quickly also about how we are changing our own practice at the Green Climate Fund and at the Independent Evaluation Unit. And how we are changing our own practice at the Independent Evaluation Unit. Okay, so deep fakes. Innovation in evidence can help explode myths and fakes. So, this is essentially a collection of evidence that has come from different sources. One of the myths, at least in the world that I occupy, which is at the Green Climate Fund and then previously as well, was to try and understand what works in different development and humanitarian situations. Right? So one of the myths for a very long time was that you couldn't really figure out as to what works in deep systemic humanitarian crisis. So should you distribute cash? Should you have food vouchers? Or should you do in-kind transfers? Two people who've been affected by conflict, by climate-related emergencies. One of the interesting systematic reviews of, again, randomized controlled trials that was put together by Hannah Tapnis and Shannon Ducey at Johns Hopkins Schools help to explode and make us understand that actually even in humanitarian crisis situations where there are no markets, and for a long time WFP, so the World Food Program and a lot of other multilateral agencies would think that cash does not work in crisis situations because there are very few markets. They showed through their systematic review that cash does work and has a multiplier effect of 2:1. So cash does work in crisis situations and is far more effective as well as efficient in terms of converting to better nutrition indicators for people that are affected by crisis in such contexts. And cash works better than in-kind transfers as well as food vouchers. Yeah? Okay. The second myth, and I'm glad that Michael referred to Abhijit and Esther, but the second myth was, and has been for a long time, that poverty is this unattainable goal that you cannot really help to alleviate. One of the wonderful 6-side studies that Abhijit Banerjee and a lot of his colleagues ended up doing was to look at a combination of packages that was called Graduating from Ultra Poverty that looked at consumption, food security, assets, finance, and a whole lot of these indicators that are associated with poverty in 6 different sites. So Ethiopia, Ghana, India, Honduras, Pakistan, and Peru. And showed that a package of these sorts of interventions that combine assets, livelihoods, training, as well as subsidies can help to improve a whole host of indicators that are related to poverty. So a multi-dimensional graduation approach may help to reduce poverty. Yeah? And they showed that with systematic evidence that employed randomized controlled trials. The third myth is, and has been for a long time, that we already know everything that we need to know. right? And the interesting thing for me is that we're constantly discovering new things. I don't know how many of you know Campbell or Cochrane. But Cochrane was one of the first establishments or initiatives that was started when in the 1960s, a pioneering doctor in Ghana discovered that although there had been evidence out there in terms of how to deal with malaria, 2 years later, he still didn't know that there was new and better evidence. Yeah? And so he started the Cochrane Collaboration. The Cochrane Collaboration has a very nice logo. Yeah? The Cochrane and this is essentially what is called a forest plot, and each one of these is actually the result of a randomized control trial. Yeah? So it's showing you the standard error as well as the mean. And what this shows is this was the result of six experiments that were done on corticosteroids, using corticosteroids. Till this evidence came along, early birth deaths, so women who were at a high risk of giving birth to babies early, were more than evenly likely to die early as well, yeah, during childbirth. These randomized control trials on corticosteroids showed that they can help to reduce early birth deaths by 50%. And essentially, it's the metadata, the meta-analysis that showed that the average effect size after doing all of these 6 randomized control trials that showed you that the proof was overwhelming, that this was going to help you reduce early birth deaths. And then this became part of medical practice, the use of corticosteroids. Myth number 4, a lot of things work. Actually, they don't. In a lot of development interventions, for example, sanitation and water-related infrastructure interventions are done and spent a lot, and a lot of development agencies spend a lot of money. So again, this is another forest plot which is essentially showing you the kind of work that is done to improve water availability, water access, and water use. And these range from improving water supply through infrastructure, water quality through the use of chlorine tablets, as well as sanitation and hygiene training. And what this shows is essentially that sanitation behavior that employs chlorine water treatment and hand washing and infrastructure actually does not induce better behavior. And this impact reduces over time. So despite a lot of money being spent into areas, especially in development interventions, many of the things that we think are working are actually not. And we now have increasing evidence to show through the use of randomized control trials, systematic reviews, meta-analysis, that a lot of these things don't work as well. Okay, so result 1. Innovations in evidence production are helping to explode myths that we all hold. Yeah? Okay. The second thing that I want to talk about is, yes, we can, innovations in technology. We all know about technology. We're sitting in South Korea. But in a lot of ways, technology is also changing the behavior of international organizations, as it should. So I come from the Green Climate Fund, which is the largest climate fund in the world. Yeah, we were basically just recently got a replenishment for $10 billion. It's an international organization, but the Green Climate Fund has been slow coming to technology as well. In one example of an investment that the Green Climate Fund is doing in Ecuador, my team and I, so we are an independent office and we report directly to the board, looked at whether the GCF secretariat or the management is doing a good job of targeting well. So we looked at a program in Ecuador which is expected to reduce carbon emissions by 15 million tons and to affect 450,000 people in Ecuador. So this is, again, GIS data. So my team essentially found and digitized the boundaries of the Ecuador forestry program and land use planning program, and then overlaid that with nighttime lights. nighttime lights data that you can essentially get quite freely now on the internet. And we found that the expectation that we are going to be influencing both forest use that exists currently, as well as that we are going to be affecting 450,000 people, is far, far overstated. And that's some information that we've taken to the board. In other examples, and this is work that has been done by Jennifer Alex Garcia as well as her co-authors, looking at payment for ecosystem services. So again, one of the ideas of payment for ecosystem services is to give money to people to not clear their lands of trees. That's payment for ecosystem services. So they looked at evidence, and now there is a systematic review as well, many systematic reviews actually, of payment for ecosystem services. But they used GIS data in Mexico to then understand whether payment for ecosystem services were working or not. They overlaid their intervention areas and created control areas or comparison areas, which is the preferred term that I like to use, to then look at the different attributes of plots that did not have interventions and compare them with plots that got the payment for ecosystem services program. The interesting thing is that they could pick up sites depending on plot characteristics. So they could use sites using slope characteristics, soil characteristics, forestry characteristics, rather than having to collect socioeconomic data. Because previous research has also shown that physiographic data is a far better predictor of land use than socioeconomic behavior, than socioeconomic variables. So they essentially used that to create comparison sites and found that payment for ecosystem services program was reducing deforestation by 2%. And they used the normalized differentiated vegetation index, or the NDVI, which is again data that you can get easily using land use patterns and satellites. They also found that there were larger impacts that were being witnessed in communally held lands rather than in privately held lands. Right? So where lands in Mexico were communally owned, their payments for ecosystem services were working far more effectively than lands that were privately held. And the effect was far greater on lands with lower slopes and those that are closer to cities and are less poor. Now, this is interesting because in my own research at the World Bank, when I was working at the World Bank, we had actually found a very converse result where most of the interventions themselves were being located in areas that were otherwise less likely to be deforested. And this placement bias is something that we dealt with, which is what they deal with here as well. But they also found that wealth gains, and wealth was measured by assets, which can, again, data can be collected through satellites as well as high-resolution maps, were not significant for anyone. So they allayed fears about increasing inequality. I want to also give you some examples of where, in my previous life, and I was at the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, or 3IE, where we used data, wearable data, rapid data, to then understand as to what was happening with respect to immunization, malaria, latrine use, and other development impacts. So on the left-hand side is an example of malaria incidence, but this is essentially trying to understand where there is high malaria incidence, and now the World Bank has started to publish malaria incidence maps on their website in a freely available way. This is something that we are driving the GCF to do as well, which is interesting. On the top is a paper that is written by colleagues looking at efforts to reduce open defecation. In South Korea, this may not be a problem, but in India, 500 million people openly defecate outside in the open, yeah, for many reasons. So for non-availability of latrines, absence of other infrastructure, etc. So colleagues of mine essentially looked at sanitation behavior, but as you can imagine, measuring sanitation behavior, which is such a personal behavioral topic, is very difficult to measure. So they used passive latrine use monitors that are installed in latrines, which are not invasive, but are able to understand as to when people are defecating or not. Yeah? And that's so that's the paper they published. In other work, colleagues of mine used wearable data to understand whether a child had been immunized. And so essentially, your wearable jewelry can help to measure can help to detect as to whether you've been to a clinic or not. When I was working at Columbia University, we helped also at the Millennium Villages project, we also helped to change the way data was being collected, which took about 3 years to process, to essentially 3 months using handheld phones and other applications. So, result 2, innovations in measurements are helping us become smarter. But then we come to this last mile question, and this is innovations in behavior, sort of segues nicely after Michael's talk. One of the key things that I think I'm learning, even though I'm a scientist, is that clearly science is not enough. Yeah? Whether you look at obesity, whether you look at drug use, alcoholism, smoking, etc., you can keep telling people, it's like the bicycle example that Michael gave, you can keep telling people what is the right evidence, but people don't change behavior. And this is essentially what brings us to the choice architecture. New work that has been done by Richard Thaler and Kahneman and Tversky and the Nobel Prize winners, etc. But choice architecture is essentially this idea that the way decisions are made are influenced by how choices are presented. Yeah? So we want to be the Spocks. We want to be processing evidence at every point in our lives, etc. But we are not. We are the Homer Simpsons, whether we like it or not. We want to be quick, reactive, but we don't want to make the effort of thinking through the evidence every time we make decisions. So we want to be here, but we are actually on that side, right? And this is essentially what Kahneman and Tversky said and talked about when they talked about the fast-thinking, slow-thinking brain. So we are constantly, through science, appealing to the slow-thinking parts of our brains, but actually it's the fast-thinking parts of our brains that are taking action. So how can you influence the fast-thinking parts of our brain? And that's where choice architecture comes to play a really important role. So in development interventions, we're using this more and more. And I'm using examples both from the work that we're doing, but also a few other agencies. And this is Médecins Sans Frontières in South Africa. For a long period of time, they were having to deal with the scourge of HIV. But it is only when Nelson Mandela stepped into their clinic and basically wore the T-shirt that, which said HIV and I'm positive, that essentially they could start to have conversations about HIV, and they formed drug clubs, where people got together, spoke about their status, but also used the community that they had to go and procure drugs, and did not have to deal with the pariah status that they had essentially been given, where everyone thought that they were in their own private hells. So that's one, change the messenger. In previous work that I've done looking at advocacy and what works in advocacy, we essentially found some messages that were not so good and some messages that were good. The messages that were not so good is that if the messenger is someone who looks like us, who talks like us, and has the similar facial features, you're far more likely to listen to them. Yeah. Which is not very good for a woman. But on the other hand, if this is someone from your community and someone who you think has made good decisions previously, you're much more likely to listen to them. So messengers definitely change the way you look at the same message. So that's one. Again, this is behavioral insights, but change the default. This is an example, again, of work that has been done by DNDi, which is a pharmaceutical research organization that works very closely with MSF. In the Congo and in Africa, for malaria, they were previously distributing 8 tablets that had to be taken twice at every sitting, but 4 times a day, which basically meant that adherence was extremely low. They did a lot of lab work to then change the way those tablets needed to be consumed and change the default to make it 2 tablets. Adherence became higher, and you essentially saw a lot of cured malaria patients. And this is combination therapy. This is Angola. What a lot of organizations that we work with find is that although you can put in a lot of effort in providing hospitalization as well as care to adults, they bring their children along. And what they realize is that children essentially throng these hospitals. To help deal with nutrition, this essentially became a 2-pronged approach where children were given, nutrition through injection or injection-looking in syringes, which was not a very effective way of getting children to absorb nutrients. Instead came ready-to-use therapeutic foods, so RUTF, which was the big innovation that was done about 10 to 15 years ago, which is essentially peanuts, but packaged with a lot of nutrients and micronutrients that changed the way nutrition was looked at, and has now been adopted by World Food Program, IFAD, and a whole lot of other food organizations to help combat severe and acute malnutrition. Okay. One other example of how we are influencing behavior is through the change of norms or making us more aware of the norms. This is pretty standard for us in Korea, but in the rest of the world, it's not. I live in Sangdo, and this is the bill that I get, right? I get to know what the average consumption of electricity is amongst my neighbors, and this is pretty standard. But this came from a behavioral insights innovation, which is essentially in the UK, they tried to understand as to what would influence energy consumption. Of course, that is, you compare your energy consumption with the neighbors around. Of course, the downside of this is that for people who are under-consuming compared to the average, you're likely to increase your consumption as well if you think that the neighbors around you, the norm, is higher than yours. This is an example of salience, and I'm going to give 2 examples. Salience is essentially the idea that you make it far more salient. The things that are important, you make it far more salient. And this is now being used. The fact that you put fruits up front and donuts at the back is now being used in a whole lot of cafeterias, in schools, in the United States, in Europe, everywhere else. Yeah? But essentially ensuring, and this is Taylor and Sunstein's work, and so they've looked at how you can make more salient the things that are important. But this is also translated and has been adopted also by the WHO in the use of checklists. So Atul Gawande talked very nicely about checklists, but these are things that now multilateral organizations are using. So checklists to point out what is important so that you don't lose the forest for the trees, the trees for the forest in this case, are really key and important. And in other examples, I can tell you about how checklists have been used to reduce both morbidity as well as mortality. And my last example in this section on behavior is priming. So, interestingly, and this is essentially to highlight yet again, that evidence is not enough. So in the 1990s, researchers and public health officials in the United States looking at evidence found that as a result of no hand washing amongst doctors who were entering surgery rooms, there were an estimated 100,000 deaths that could be directly or indirectly attributed to the lack of hand washing among surgeons. And one would think surgeons should know better. They know the disease theory better than you and I do, so they should know better. But doctors know it's good to wash hands, but they don't. And this was the cause of high morbidity as well as mortality levels in hospitals in the United States. So the University of Miami and Imperial College essentially joined hands. Yeah? And they said, well, what if we put hand sanitizers at the entrance of surgery rooms, and that'll just make it easier. So they did a lot of qualitative research. They tried to understand why surgeons and doctors don't wash hands, and a lot of them explained, well, they have many surgeries to go to, and it's really hard, and they take off their gloves, and then they wear another set of gloves. But of course, when you peel off gloves, you touch your other hand, and stuff like that. So a lot of very good, deep, qualitative work went into understanding as to why doctors were as neglectful about washing hands as they were. So access, giving them clearer, quicker access to sanitizers was clearly thought to be one way in which they could be helped. But what the team of researchers at the University of Miami and Imperial College London said, well, let's try and combine this with a few other things that we know from behavioral psychology. Yeah? They then put photographs of men's eyes on top of the sanitizer, so someone's watching you. Then they also put women's eyes, yeah? Some woman is watching you. Okay? And then there's a third thing they did, which is they sprayed lemon scent at the entrance of these doors. Okay? Any guesses for results? Okay. So the control is where they just put the hand sanitizer. Okay? So easy access, that basically increased hand sanitizing behavior by 15 percentage points. 15 percentage points, some nice change, but not sufficient if you're seeing a lot of deaths occur. Again, very damning for me, women's eyes. 21.6 percentage points, right? So over your control, it's about a 6.6 percentage points increase. Yeah, increase, but definitely not as effective as men's eyes, which is 33. Yeah, so 33 percentage points over your control, so about 18 percentage points increase over your control. Great. But this is what happens. When you spray lemon scent, it nudges the fast-thinking part of your brain to think about antiseptics. You associate lemon scent with cleanliness. In fact, it's being used now, this idea. And so, okay, in this case, doctors ended up sanitizing their hands far more than any of the other experimental arms. Yeah? In fact, and this is just a mischievous sort of side remark, a lot of waiters now use this in their restaurants because they don't want to clean tables. So they spray lemon scent, and people sitting, their clients sitting at their own tables, don't dirty their tables as much. Okay, so result 3, innovations in understanding behaviors helping us deliver the last mile better. And why this was interesting to us was that in a lot of development interventions, my own work in agricultural insurance, in thinking about providing actuarially fair financial instruments to smallholder farmers in developing countries shows that you can do everything right. And this is true for the Green Climate Fund, this is true for the World Bank, this is true for the UN, etc. You can do everything right, but most of these organizations are very supply-driven. They come with the idea that, yes, if you put in the infrastructure, you pour in the money, that you are going to see the benefits that you anticipate. And the key hypothesis that we are now pushing through is that's clearly not enough, because you've got to think about the last mile. How are you influencing the delivery and the absorption and the uptake of a lot of this infrastructure, science, evidence, etc., so that behavior is actually changing? Okay, so how are we changing? Yeah, and I want to give you 2 quick examples and finish. First, in my office, so we started, and in multilateral organizations, if there are any of you here, I know Michael's worked with the World Bank, but thinking about randomized control trials is a huge, huge thing, and most of them have essentially resisted it. Mainly because you don't want to change implementation, and there's some resistance in terms of how organizations are structured to thinking about production of good evidence. So what we've done is we've essentially said we want to measure change caused by and attributable to Green Climate Fund investments. And we've essentially said that the components of this are not just good baseline data collection and endline data collection and continuous data collection, but you need to incorporate designs to produce good evidence and measure impact. So into the projects themselves that are being planned and invested in, you have to start to think about how to produce good evidence from these investments. And so we are helping through the LORTA program, Learning-Oriented Real-Time Impact Assessment work. We are helping to co-design measurement systems, think about getting teams on the ground to think about setting up counterfactuals on comparison groups and getting them to think as well as making them aware of identification methods. Randomized control trials are one way, but of course in many cases we also have to think about quasi-experimental methods, and so we are helping them think through some of those as well. So that's one. The second is impact bonds, and I really, personally, this is a huge opportunity, I think, that organizations like the GCF should be thinking about, where they can combine financial returns with environmental and social goods. So this chart itself is taken and then altered from the Financial Times. It was a wonderful small article that sort of, and we'd been thinking about it a lot at the IU and at the GCF, but the chart itself is a very nice picture, so I just used it from the FT. But essentially, it gives you the example of a rhino bond. The South African government and the Kenyan government have been thinking for a very, very long time about how to save rhinos. It's not working, and they're putting in lots of money, lots of effort. So, impact bonds, or rhino impact bonds, is a new innovation that they've essentially come up with and that we are espousing with them, which essentially include a few things. First, you need to have investors who commit money to who are interested in saving rhinos. Yeah? And this is typically the private sector. But then there should be agencies like the GCF, like the World Bank, etc., that are interested in achieving these very goals, except they realize that not a lot of this is being done out there in an effective way. Yeah? So this is essentially changing the structure of how you invest money, because we know that structure breeds behavior. Yeah? So outcome peers is essentially organizations that say that yes, they want to change the way they are investing, but they don't want to take on the risk. So that's why no risk. And then evaluation. So my job is essentially to come in and say, well, did you actually achieve the objectives that you wanted to? Save the rhinos. And if we can say in an attributable way, using, say, randomized control trials or other such things, that yes, you have, then investors are paid back by the outcome payers. And if not, then essentially investors don't get paid. Yeah? So these are ideas around impact bonds that we're getting the GCF and other organizations to think about in a far more salient way. So final slide, conclusions. Innovations in evidence production is helping us explode myths. Second, innovations in technology are helping us to measure better. Third, understanding behavior is helping us deliver the last mile. And last but not least, evaluation practice is changing. Thank you.